and Jacob are here, and I know Stephen and Lene are on their way. First off, I just want to say thank you to the Oregon Department of Administrative Services for hosting us. Please feel free to help yourself to food at any point in the meeting, drinks, just take care of your needs. The bathrooms are through the doors and then down the hallway and to the right, and there's also a water fountain over there as well if you want more water. Okay, and then Open Signal, do you mind sharing the slideshow? Okay. So big picture, I'm just going to start us off with an overview of today's meeting. Currently, the Portland Children's Levy has two big bodies of work that are moving. The first is issuing large grants per City Council's decision on June 25th and planning for the small grants funding process this upcoming fall, winter, and spring. And so today we will be discussing both funding processes. We have 4 outcomes for this meeting, and they're listed up on the slide. They are for you to provide input on the Community Council's role in the upcoming small grants funding process, to advise staff on whether an organization can reapply for funding in the small grants funding round if they received funding during the last small grants funding round, to generate prompts for the video component of the small grants application, and to provide feedback to staff on the large grants funding process. So if you take a look at the agenda that you picked up when you came in or the one that's attached to the email, we're going to work to achieve these outcomes by spending about the first 2.5 hours on small grants items. So we'll orient you to the small grants funding process, timeline, and proposed community council role. We'll gather your feedback through large group discussion, discuss and vote on the policy question of whether organizations that previously received PCL small grants funding would be eligible for funding this round. And then we'll do some small group work in small groups to brainstorm prompts for the video component of the small grants application. From there, we're going to move to working on large grants funding process content. And so staff are going to provide an update of what's happened since we last convened in March. You'll have open space for large group discussion and questions, and then we'll close with some solo time to complete an evaluation of the large grants funding process. And then we'll close with our standard wrap-up and meeting evaluation. There will be 2 10-minute breaks. So the first will be around 2:05, and the next will be around 3:15. And we're currently scheduled to end around 4:45. And I built the agenda knowing that some items might take more or less time. But I'll manage our time to make sure that we're done by 5 p.m. at the latest. Do any community council members have any questions about meeting outcomes or the agenda before we move on? Let me just check folks virtually. I see Stephen's here, Jacob and Karina and Lene as well. Welcome, you all. Okay, so we'll go ahead and pass it over to Erica.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about small grants. So in this section, we are going to orient you to the Small Grants Fund, why it was established, the priorities and purpose of the fund, the 2020 small grants funding process, and the lessons that we learned from that process. You can go to the next slide, Joel. Yeah. So the Small Grants Fund was launched in 2020 in response to community feedback. In 2018, PCL had contracted with Portland State University, university's Center for Improvement of Child and Family Services, to review its 2014 grant-making process and recommend improvement in advance of its 2019-2020 competitive process. The team led focus groups and interviews with funded and unfunded applicants. The report had 30 recommendations, including creating a small grants fund for organizations that had not had access to PCL funds. PCL also contracted with Empress Rules Equity Consulting to conduct a 9-month community engagement process to inform PCL's 2019-2020 priorities. Empress Rules engaged over 500 community members and service providers. They also recommended that PCL create small grants opportunities. The Small Grants Fund launched in 2020. The purpose of the fund is to increase equity in programs of small organizations arising from marginalized communities that serve children, youth, and families who identify as Black, Indigenous, people of color, immigrant and refugees, LGBTQ2 SIA+, people with disabilities, and other marginalized groups. Small grants funds support the capacity of these organizations to improve the quality of service, increase the number of children, youth, and families served, and be more inclusive of children with disabilities. You can go to the next, there we go. The 2020 application process included 2 steps. It was led by an ad hoc group of 6 community volunteers that we called the design team. The first step involved a short written application describing the organization and program. The design team reviewed all written applications and recommended about 1/3 of the applicants move forward to a second step. It included a written application. The second step included a written application with a budget and additional program information and an interview with community reviewers and staff. Go to the next slide. Okay. Oh, no, here we are. We're in the right spot. Okay. So based on staff experience and feedback from applicants, reviewers, here are some key strengths and suggested improvements from the 2020 small grants process. For strengths, an application with both written portion and an interactive portion. This gave applicants different opportunities to communicate their work. A short and easy written application that was low burden on small organizations, and design team and reviewers' involvement in both scoring and recommending applications helped staff integrate community voice into funding recommendations that went to the allocation committee for decision. Some of the improvements suggested were using an interactive component with all applicants alongside the written application. So again, in the last process, only people who moved to the second step got the interactive part. In 2020, we only used that interactive component with applicants who moved from step 1 to step 2. And at that point, they got to participate in an interview. Using a storytelling opportunity for all gives each applicant culturally relevant ways to highlight their strengths. We also wanted to, another improvement is to consider ways to include visual or storytelling elements to their application other than interviews. It was logistically difficult to schedule 2 reviewers, PCL staff, and applicants, and a few applicants and reviewers indicated the interview format itself wasn't ideal. Yeah. Oh. Do you have any questions about this part before we move on? We still had this part.
Do you know what wasn't ideal, what the feedback was about what wasn't ideal about the format?
Well, the interview format was kind of the way you might think of a virtual job interview. And so everyone was answering the same questions kind of in the same way, there were comments about like you really felt that power kind of differential, and like we had one group that wanted to come and show us like a video they made or a PowerPoint or something, and we couldn't do that because we couldn't give that. Not everybody had that, and so it was kind of that feedback that it wasn't, you couldn't be unique in it in the same way. And that like that power dynamic, as well as the logistical things that we talked about, like trying to schedule 10 people for the same time slot is challenging, as we all know. Other questions about that part? No? Okay. So that was what we did, and now we're going to talk about the upcoming small grants round. Hold on. Okay. My mic on again? Thanks. Okay, so now we'll go over the timeline for the small grants funding round and your potential role in the process. These dates will likely shift based on when the allocation committee, community council, and city council meetings are scheduled, as well as your feedback today. Given lessons learned from 2020, the small grants application will have 2 components for all applicants to complete and submit on one due date. So 2 components, 1 step. There will not be separate steps. The 2 components are a short written application and a video component. This approach allows PCL to honor applicant feedback to keep a visual storytelling element, especially for all applicants. It also streamlines the funding process and aims to right-size to match the 1.5 million available to grant over 3 years. So having 2 steps to grant out 1.5 million is a lot in 1 step. So we are proposing that community council play 2 roles in the small grants funding process. First, review and score the video portion of the small grants applications. And second, participate in making funding recommendations. With this decision-making process still being crafted, we are currently thinking that staff could bring initial funding recommendations to the community council to evaluate and revise. Once the community council has made their recommendations, they would be released to applicants and be brought to the allocation committee for approval before going to city council for final approval. In order to participate in the decision-making meeting, community council members need to have watched and scored all application videos. This timeline represents our current plan and again is subject to change. The light blue bar on top represents actions taken by the applicants. So as you can see that we would have the applications open for the applicants to apply in fall of this year, fall, early winter. And then in the spring, they would be submitting their applicant testimony, and the grants would start next year in July. The yellow bar represents actions taken by community council, allocation committee, or city council. So we're having that summer community council meeting right now. We'd have an allocation committee meeting in the fall. If you're doing the video review, we'd have training for you in the winter. We'd have the community council meeting sometime in the winter also to make funding recommendations. The allocation committee meets in the spring, and then city council meets in the spring. And the dark blue bar represents actions taken by staff. So we're currently developing the funding process. And we have already drafted written applications, which you've received. We'll edit that written application, create video submission guidance and scoring criteria based on today's feedback, and circulate the application and scoring criteria to potential applicants for feedback. Staff will integrate feedback, and then the allocation committee will review and approve the funding process, including the written and video components. The application period is from, like we already talked about that, from mid-October to early December. If you decide you want to review the videos, We'd hold those reviewer trainings in the winter, and reviews would be due about 4 weeks later. Simultaneously, staff will review and score the written portion of the application. Staff would use the scores generated by community council and staff, along with other criteria in the application, to make initial funding recommendations. The community council would meet sometime in winter to evaluate and revise those. Your funding recommendations would then be released to applicants, and then the allocation committee would review and meet in spring, followed by city council. So again, the goal is for small grants to begin July 1, 2026. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Okay. Oh,
Does anyone have any questions before we have a little bit of large group discussion about the timeline that we just laid out, small grants funding process?
I have a small question, maybe it's irrelevant, but the videos that small groups are able to submit, is it similar to an application where they're going to be answering questions, or could they just take an organizational video and be like, this is what we do? How specific to the application is the video?
So today, a little bit later, we're going to be, you all will be developing kind of questions or prompts that they would need to be answering in the video. So it would probably be pretty catered unless they just happen to already have a video that addresses those particular prompts.
I like the idea of reviewing videos, and I was just curious if it's like multiple weeks, or is it 2 months that the council would have to review?
I think we're currently imagining about 4 weeks. It depends on, the timeline is still up in the air, and so it depends on when we get all of the application materials in, how quickly we're able to train them, and then, or train you all, and then how that aligns with the winter holidays and wanting to give some buffer time around the fact that that might be falling over the Christmas holiday and the New Year's holiday. But at a minimum, we would give you 4 weeks. And if you all decide that you want to participate in making funding recommendations, because we will be discussing actual applicants with names and identifying information this time. It would not be de-identified. We are asking for you to be able to come to that meeting fully informed by having watched and scored all the videos as a part of that.
I have a couple of questions. Okay. Okay, I have a couple questions. So one is the accessibility component to the video. Is there going to be are we going to be discussing today about requirements as far as accessibility? Because I know people have different.
Let go of the button.
Oh, I don't have to click the button? Oh my gosh, sorry. It's been a minute since I've been in person. So I was my first question was, are we going to be discussing today any accessibility requirements as far as the video? There are going to be people us watching it that may have accessibility needs, but I understand that is maybe difficult for some organizations to implement. Also, the length of the video, is that what we're going to be doing today? The required length or minimum, and format, all those things, and then also what would be the process? Let's say by chance, an organization that's submitting a video, we may have a conflict of interest.
So first of all, when you say accessibility on Marachi, are you talking about language accessibility or disability accessibility, or both?
I would say digital accessibility. So one being for on disability end, like closed captioning, like clarity as well, to be able to be seen, and then also accessibility as far as language as well. But the main thing being digital accessibility for those who may have disabilities.
Okay, so for the disability piece, when you upload a video, they will be uploading it to a site like a YouTube or a Vimeo or something, and they don't have to do much on their end. There's options for us to pull up closed captioning from the video on there if you're doing it through that website. So like closed captioning or like visual description for visually impaired, those are kind of built into those programs. And so that part is taken care of. From the language piece, they would be able to submit videos in a variety of different languages, and then we would get those translated and things through the city's got resources for that. So that is a possibility as well. We did that. And also the captions, you can do subtitles, like if you're doing it on YouTube or whatever, there's like subtitles that you can do to manage that. So that piece. And then the other piece you asked was about conflict of interest. Is that right? I think I'll turn over the conflict of interest question to Meg.
Sure, happy to answer that. With regard to scoring applications, we would have you all have to review the list of applicants, and if you had a conflict of interest, you would have to opt out of scoring that particular application. And then when it comes to voting on recommendations, you would also need to declare your conflict of interest as part of the meeting and opt out of voting for that as well.
Okay, so kind of the usual process.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Thank you.
Yeah, since we have it already on, I had a couple more questions about the video, and not to do too much in the weeds if this is like for a further conversation later, but I was curious. I know some folks are not necessarily used to being on camera, but have a great story to tell. So I was curious if you're going to be giving some prompts, like it can just be a blank wall behind you, just helping people feel really comfortable with how bare bones I assume we're happy with, and then maximum length and stuff like that.
Yes, I think the length that we already decided on was 5 minutes. So nobody, like, if we received a video that was like 10 minutes long, we'd have to cut it off because that's just too much. So they would have all the instructions about, you know, we try to minimize like shaking hands, you know, put the camera up somewhere that it's going to be still. Backgrounds, try to avoid distracting backgrounds and background noise, and like all of that, we would give them instructions.
I have another question too. Did you, or just a clarifying one, did you say like if someone didn't follow the directions, if they submitted a 10-minute video, you would just stop it at 5 minutes and the reviewers would not be able to hear the second half?
Yeah. I mean, I think depending on, I don't know, we haven't talked about that at length and staff, but I believe and I wish Yusheen was here because I think that's what she did with the applicant testimony, or we could, if there's enough time, you know, sometimes you have a situation where like the deadline is like 5 p.m. and someone submits something incorrectly at 4:59. So there's not time to go back and say, hey, if you edit this yourself or resubmit. So we might be able to, if there was enough time to say, just so you know, we can't take over this length, and you could resubmit something if you can make it by the deadline. But I think if it was past the deadline, we'd have to cut it off.
Stephen, Lene, Karina, Jacob, do any of you all have any questions before we move on?
I don't have any questions. Thank you.
I have one small question, yes, about technology access, you know, and also the ability for people to, the difference in quality, I guess, that's kind of the big question. Do we feel that, like, there should be some assistance, or if people are just, like, not technologically savvy, or they're just not able to do it, is there any kind of assistance we can help provide or suggest for them, such as like Open Signal? Hey, there's a small fee, but Open Signal could potentially be your person or another organization that could give help.
Thanks for that example, because I wasn't sure which type of assistance you were thinking of, Jacob. When, like, other organizations, like PSEF has done this, they've said you don't score based on, video quality, but based on the content of the story, and pretty much most folks have access to, someone in the organization has access to a cell phone that can take a video, if not every person in the organization. So that is one thing. I do think it's imperfect in terms of equal access, but I also think that's true with just a written application. In the prior small grants process, we heard a lot of feedback we had a lot of small immigrant-led organizations that landed in the bottom third in the first step of the process. And a lot of them felt that what I heard was feedback that they wanted the storytelling piece up front. They wanted like a way to show like the uniqueness of their programs. And they wanted it to be up front, that the written piece alone felt limiting to them. So this is an effort to create access in a different way. But I do realize it's imperfect.
No worries. Just, yeah.
Can I just lift up something, Erica, that you said? I think we want to be, I think we're not trying to move toward really polished looking videos or really produced. I think we're just trying to give people an opportunity to communicate their work in a format that isn't written. And so I hear your question, Jacob, and I appreciate why assistance would be important. And I think we hope that we design this video component to be as low barrier as possible, so people can, like Erica said, use phones and sort of give us the most simply produced piece in order to showcase to you all what they're trying to do.
I had a question. So, just to clarify, so that means that before, like during the training, that they'll address the bias to look after and just be mindful of, like, not scoring based on editing and things like that, right? That would be addressed.
Yes, that would be part of the reviewer training.
Just want to clarify.
Dean, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, just for clarification, this is not the final step in the application process, correct?
So in this application process, there would be just one, so they would only submit one, there's only one step in the sense of they're submitting pretty much the video and the written application at the same time. There's multiple steps in that there's community council reviewing, and there's allocation committee, and there's city council and all of that. But from the applicant's perspective, this is their step.
Gotcha, but it's not just like a video and nothing else.
Correct.
All right, good. Because if you can make a good video, there's obviously the chance you can get a grant for something that you aren't particularly well suited for. So you have to make sure that you have the balancing process. So I just want to make sure that was baked in. All right, thank you.
Okay, so before we move on to this policy question, I just had a couple of questions for the community council. I just wanted to confirm that everyone is comfortable with the community council playing the role of watching and scoring applicant videos for the Small Grants Fund. Yeah. If you are attending virtually, do you mind just giving me a thumbs up or a yes in the chat? And Meg, do you mind monitoring that for me?
All four virtual folks are on board.
Great. And then the one other item that I wanted to confirm is that the community council wants to participate in making funding decisions for the small grants fund. Yeah. Alex, is that a yes from you? Yep. Okay.
Virtual folks, Stephen, Lene, Karina, and Jacob, will you give us another round of yeses or no's or thumbs up or thumbs down on involvement in decision making?
Okay.
So I just want to make sure that it's clear to everyone that when we say that you're making funding recommendations in this round, you would know who the applicants are. Like, this is not anonymous. Okay. Okay. Just checking for that. Understand.
Okay, thank you all. So we will go ahead and move on to this policy question that we have that Erica is going to tee up. So we covered orientation, we covered timeline, what your role is going to be, and now we are getting into the nitty gritty. Erica?
Thanks for bearing with us. It's a lot of information to take in all at once. Okay, so at this point, we're going to talk about an applicant eligibility question. So the question that we are seeking the answer to is, are organizations that previously received small grants eligible to reapply for funding in this round? So we're going to begin with some context. The Small Grants Fund must comply with PCL's authorizing act, and the act requires that grants are allocated in all of PCL's 6 program areas, that the funds comprise no more than 30% of an organization's revenue, that grants are made through a competitive process, and that the staff monitor and evaluate funded programs for performance. Additionally, organizations must have revenues between $90,000 and $750,000 to be eligible. The allocation committee allocated $1.5 million over 3 years for the Small Grants Fund. The minimum grant amount is $30,000 annually, and the maximum annual grant size is $80,000. Okay. The previous small grants funding round was open to organizations without levy funds that also served communities that have been historically underserved by the levy. As a result, 100% of the 7 grantees were new to levy funding. Among the 7 small grants fund grantees, 6 grew their organizational revenue to a point where they were eligible to apply for a large grant and are no longer eligible for a small grant. 1 organization remains eligible for a small grant. Based on the new minimum and maximum grant amounts, PCL estimates that 6 to 10 small grants could be awarded. But here are some considerations and trade-offs. Allowing organizations to reapply creates space for the smallest grassroots organizations that previously received small grants funds to grow at their own pace, to receive ongoing reliable funding and benefit from PCL's support, including training and capacity building efforts for their financial systems. These organizations may be partly volunteer run or have a fiscal sponsor at the time of application. They may need multiple small grants from PCL to grow to the size of organizations that are eligible for larger grants, or in some cases, they may choose to remain small. Allowing organizations to reapply gives small grants recipients the same opportunity for continued access to PCL funds as large grants have, rather than place a limitation on them that large organizations don't have with PCL funds. On the other hand, restricting small grant resources to one-time funding would prioritize access for organizations who haven't received PCL funds. Based on PCL's experience with small grantees so far, restricting small grant resources to one-time funding works best for organizations with more capacity and revenues on the higher end among their small org peers. These orgs are better positioned to take full advantage of the capacity building opportunities and can likely grow enough to apply for PCL's large grants after only a few years.
Okay. So to get your guidance on this question, we are going to do a round of pair work, and then we're going to have some large group discussion and then take a vote. So depending on how the process goes, we might loop back after your vote to hear more about your reasons for why you voted the way that you did. Go ahead, Lisa. Can you use your mic?
How long, how many years is the grant?
3 years.
So is it like $30,000 a year for 3 years, or is it $30,000 a year total?
No.
$30,000 total, sorry.
It would be like 30,000 a year for 3 years. And then there's options for renewal. But yeah, it's a 3-year grant, 30,000. So if you're at the 90,000, that's 30,000 per year for 3 years.
I have another question. As reviewers, would we be notified if a group had received a small grant already? Or would that be an anonymous thing that wouldn't like bias our opinions?
Well, it depends on how you all decide this policy. If you decide this policy that an organization that has had levy funds that was a small grantee in the past cannot reapply, then you would never see their application because we would screen them out. So this is really only, this is a policy question that at this point really only affects one organization.
But it could affect other organizations in the future. So yeah, it affects kind of the direction of how we want to.
Okay, I'll rephrase then. So if we decided as a council to allow a group to reapply if they had received funding, would we know which group it was that had received the funding?
I think it depends on how they answer the questions in the application. I don't know that we would go out of our way to ask them a yes/no question, for example, on the application that is only relevant to one applicant.
I mean, it's technically public information that is available on our website as to who the small grantees are, and that will remain up there for the entire time they're small grantees. So you would have a way to find out, I guess is what I'm saying. It could not be kept a secret, I guess, or something like that.
But I guess I think if your point was more about like, does it matter with regard to what you all decide or how to score, I think I would encourage you, if you make a policy decision today to allow reapplication, then I don't think you want to then add an additional weight or criteria around whether they should be more or less prioritized.
Can I just ask a clarifying question? When you say it only affects one grantee, I think I'm confused, because wouldn't it affect all of the current grantees?
No, they said all of them had grown out.
Oh, sorry, I missed that too. Okay, only one that is still too small enough to receive the small grant. Thank you.
Yeah, Jamie's correct.
Just a clarifying question. Would we be able to vote on more than like a simple yes or no? Like, could we potentially say, suggest that like there only be allowed up to 3 organizations in the past who to reapply, so that there could be like a balance between the two, because that could be obviously that has its own problems, but also its own strengths. But it could be a compromise solution, so that could be effective. So I just want to know if we're encouraged to give more than a simple yes or no between those two options. Thank you.
So I would say no to something that just says, because if we had 5 organizations that were eligible to apply and we capped it at 3, that doesn't seem fair to the other 2, right? Like there has to be a way to choose that's fair to everybody. So it's yes, you can or not, but wait. But you do have the option we'll be creating criteria, scoring criteria. So like in the last round, as you know, there was sort of a weight towards, for example, smaller organizations or things like that. So in the scoring criteria, there can be like weights to things. But for this round, I would discourage that because that's too much in the weeds for this round.
Just to clarify, what I mean by that is that there would be a cap on not necessarily those allowed to apply, but simply like there would be a preset 30% determined maximum potential for for the three highest scoring organizations in the small grants process, while 70%, so the seven others hypothetically, would be would be all new organizations that have not received grants funding before. Just to clarify what I meant.
I guess I don't. I guess I don't really see the. Like I can see what you're saying. I mean, to me, it's either a yes or a no. In the large grants, there is no. You can apply for the large grants as many times as you want and are eligible. And I think having the opportunity to continue to receive stable funding for organizations is huge, and so we run the risk of kind of replicating something that is really toxic in nonprofit funding, where funders want new funding for new organizations and new ideas, and then we kind of let programming that really works and is doing good things in community fall by the wayside because it's not new or different or shiny. So I would caution us to, tinker too much around setting quotas or, putting too many strict boundaries on who we can and can't fund. Because we risk kind of painting ourselves into a corner in that scenario, when I think we can do the same thing we did in the large funding round, which is create some priorities, create some criteria, and create our funding recommendations based on that.
I do have to note that I understand the perspective, Alex. I do disagree to an extent with it, simply due to I think that makes sense for some organizations that really need the funds. That Children's Levy is the best source of those funds, for example, and that they score and qualify well for, while also making sure that we still do fund new organizations. So there still needs to be that balance. So that's my personal, of course, opinion.
I just wanted to chime in. I think this came up with a large grants funding cycle too, that not being biased toward clearly successful past applicants, and so I would look to staff to help guide us in like some anti-bias training.
Okay, so does anyone have any other questions about what we're going to do? So we're going to move into pair work, where you're going to talk about, I'll give you some prompts for pair work. We'll have a large group discussion, and then we're going to take a vote. Does anyone have any questions before we kind of move into that process? No? Okay. So we have the question that you're going to vote on and that you're going to discuss up on the screen. And whichever option receives a majority of votes will be the policy that staff implement in this upcoming small grants funding round. Okay, so we have 4 virtual participants and 6 in person. So if you are in person, if you can turn to the person next to you for pair work. If you are virtual, Joel or John will break you out into 2 sets of breakout rooms. And you're going to have 10 minutes in your pairs. And so as you have this conversation with your partner, please consider the following questions. What factors, and I think, Joel, can you go to the next slide? I think there's one more slide. Yeah. So what factors are you weighing as you consider this question? If you're leaning towards a specific position, please share why. And then ask clarifying and curious questions of your partner to better understand their position and address your confusions, and then identify any other questions that you have for staff that you want to bring back to the large group discussion. Okay, so we can go ahead and move into pair work, and I will keep track of time. We'll wait for the breakout rooms to close. In about a minute, so don't hold your breath. We still have 50 seconds.
I don't have my mic on. Okay, we're going to start with if there are any questions that came out of your groups that you all have for staff. And if not, we'll just move on to having groups, pairs share out. But if anybody, including online, okay, nobody?
Jacob said no questions.
Okay. So I'd like to ask if there's a couple of pairs who would be willing to share out what factors you all were weighing as you consider the policy question.
I'll share what we talked about. I think we were both leaning toward saying yes, people can reapply. One of the things we talked about was the ways that it doesn't seem to make sense to put extra limitations on the small grants that we don't put on the larger grants for lots of reasons, but the other piece of things that we talked a bit about is that by creating this limitation, you are taking the opportunity for funding away from folks who are also not eligible to receive other PCL funding, which doesn't seem to make a lot of sense for folks who have been receiving this like stable funding for 3 years. And it also, we talked a bit about it possibly creating some artificial kind of external pressure to grow your organization larger than you might because you want to tip up over that eligibility scale for the large grants if you're unable to apply for the small grants more than once. So like some organizations are sub $750,000 organizations and should stay sub $750,000 organizations, and we should support orgs in staying the size that is right for them, not the size that they need to get to capture stable funding. So that was kind of the like key. Did I miss anything? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Oh, go ahead, Dean.
So I think that at the end, if I remember correctly, we did come to different conclusions in our group, and Alex made some very great points. At the same time, we had a deep conversation ourselves, and one thing that swayed me on the no side is the fact that so when organizations put those grants and are reliant upon those grants to fund those programs, they put them in their standard operating budget. They get it becomes sort of standard procedure for them to expect that. And I think that's not something that we should be really, even unintentionally, even if they are not intending to. I don't think that's like an expectation that they probably will based on their quality application, that we should be really providing, to anyone. I think that creates a false expectation. And I simply think it's more fair if we say, look, you have a great program. You have a niche community, and you might not need to grow. At the same time, some of these organizations are serving niche communities. Some of them also don't have like the finest financial status, and that's fine when you're like applying and stuff like that. But I think that like they shouldn't become reliant upon a single organization. I don't think it's necessarily our role to be that sort of savior for that organization, as we should be really focused on the quality of and making sure that we are funding as many sustainable organizations as possible, because I think that we need to focus on sustainability. And so I think that if we sort of focus on it to a degree, that if we do this, then it opens a door to organizations building their entire operating system around, of course, these costs and stuff like that. And I think that's simply not a fair thing to do. So I understand that's going to be controversial. So
I just want to clarify really fast, though, that there is eligibility criteria that the PCL grant can't comprise more than 30% of your overall budget. So you're not going to create an organization that has an operating budget that is comprised by more than 30% PCL funding. So I just want to clarify that.
Right, I was not meaning that in the sense of like, say, making up over 50% of your budget. I was stating in terms of like needing the PCL specifically and becoming reliant upon that to basically fulfill the complete functions and responsibilities of your organization, and that becoming like a built-in assumed cost, assumed sort of opportunity that is reliable. And I think that even though obviously they can never count on it, I think it can create a sort of sense of sort of expectation, and especially if like it's through 2 or 3 different processes and they've all been approved for that again and again. I think it might just be more fair to not create that expectation and make sure that they can also sustain themselves for searching for other degrees of funding. I think we should be creating things where people are not dependent upon grants. So.
Thank you, Dean. I am going to make space for Jacob to speak. I hear Jacobson, and then Lene.
I created a mess.
Perfect. Yeah, me and Lene remember that, and we both kind of lean towards allowing people to reapply even if they've received funding in the past. Our big focus again is I kind of voiced a little bit of the same concerns, just making sure that our language in allowing people to reapply is stating that is not a guarantee, because every time there's a new round of funding, the vision or the vision or the expectations could change. So just making sure that they understand that just because their program was awarded during this season of rounds of funding, it can change due to whatever is kind of the main focus of the next season of funding. So that's kind of what I found that was super important.
Thank you. Lene, do you want to speak as well, or was that kind of covering your whole pair?
Yeah, I didn't know Jacob also had his hand raised. So thanks for starting that off, Jacob. I just want to reiterate, that organizations, whether they're small or large, they are dependent on grants, right? Whether that's just PCL or any other funding. And I think as long as we're clear in our language that they're eligible, but obviously not guaranteed, and the decision may or may not affect, them to be able to apply moving forward. I think we should allow it only because they are specifically small grants. And if they were awarded it's hard to create sustainability. If we're trying to sustain programs or seek outcomes for students, it's really hard to see significant outcomes in students in 1 year of a grant. And so I think if we valued their work in previous years or felt that it was meeting the focus areas or the, areas of priority, whether those change in the future, that should affect it. But I think if the areas that we're still focusing on in the subsequent year aligns with their program, and it would help them continue to seek outcomes for those students that we already said we found to be valuable, or not necessarily growing their organization, but they're sustaining their efforts at current capacity. I think it's important to give them an opportunity to apply again.
Thank you, Lene. I'm going to call on Amarachi and then Stephen.
Okay, I was gonna say. Okay, I was gonna say that I definitely. I mean, I agree with a lot of the sentiment said about. I'm in support of allowing them to reapply again. It's one organization, but I know it sets a precedent as well, so I understand the importance of it. I think one thing is that in my opinion, I think we are here for program sustainability. And as somebody who has worked in a nonprofit where we receive small grants and then that was the one time and that's it, we weren't able to get it again, it's really hard to get a program established, and it can take sometimes a couple years. And I do think it's okay that they rely on grants, because that's just how nonprofit works. And it's just 30%. It's up to the requirements, like only up to 30%, comprise 30% of their. So they're not going to solely rely on PCL anyways. But even then, like, we want to be a part of sustainability, and at the end of the day, we want to be a part of making sure that the desired outcomes are being reached. And anyways, I would also say that just the requirements for the small grants already lends itself naturally, as we see with the fact there's only one that's going to be reapplying. It naturally lends itself to new applicants already. So the balance is already kind of created of supporting supporting new applicants, but also helping organizations that do need continued support with it, but they only are eligible for a small grant. So to me, the balance is already there. But it is really important to sometimes different organizations and programs have different needs, and sometimes they will stay within the parameters of what they qualify for a small grant, and they may need more support and more assistance, and that's okay, because above all, we want to make sure that these programs are in the long term successful. And so that's where I stand, and I think that just some need more time.
Thank you. Stephen, you want to go ahead?
Sure. Thank you. And thanks everyone for raising such great points and bringing nuance to this question and the potential implications. I think one question that I have that might help is with the application itself, which I know we'll go through that in a little bit. So let me know if we should wait on this question. But right now, I think as it's worded, it asks about the program activities and outcomes. But to Dean's point around ongoing funding of the same program, let's say hypothetically, there's a really strong organization and program that chooses to stay within this budget range and is mature in different ways, has a strong program and strong application that's successful. Would they be able to submit submit a small grant application for the same program again and again? Or are there any requirements, whether through the application itself or through policies, that the small grant be for a new program if or when they were to apply again in the future?
In the large grants, we allow people to apply again and again for the same program. They don't have to apply in a different program area. And many have been continuing to get PCL grants for 10 to 20 years for much of the time for the same program, although they may apply in different areas. So I don't see why. Often some of the really small organizations only really have one main program and maybe some supplementary things, like a youth council or like smaller projects, but they often have like one main program. So I guess that would be a thing to discuss, but I wouldn't anticipate like asking them to apply for a different program each time.
Sure, that makes sense. And if I could add, I personally am leaning towards voting yes, that organizations can apply again and again. And I appreciate that point around developing a dependency where, or more so, maybe even an expectation where and I could be off base here, but if an organization is successful in multiple rounds, um, they and this perhaps is not on us to manage expectations necessarily, but there may be some expectations of receiving in the future, or just as Dean was pointing out, they're kind of building it into their budget. And in the future, if they were to lose that funding, it could have it just the experience I think is more challenging, and I want to say we might have seen some of that with the large grant cycle. So it's just a consideration and factor for us to keep in mind. Um, but I hear the challenges on both sides.
Thank you, Stephen. Okay, so I'm going to see if there's any other consideration, anything else that anyone has burning that they want to add. And then if not, we're going to wrap up this discussion and Katrina is going to take us to a vote. But I want to make sure that everybody who wants to speak has had a chance to do so first. Okay. Katrina, take it away.
Okay, so we are going to go ahead and take a vote. Don't click on the link yet, though, because I haven't activated it yet. But yes, it will. When you click on the link, it will be the question that you saw listed previously, and you can just select yes or no, and whichever option gets the most votes will be the policy that staff implement. So let me change the settings. Okay, so you should be able to access the form now. It is called Community Council Vote Small Grants Policy Question, and it is in the email that I sent out this morning with the activity link. Okay, so we have the results in. I'm wondering if you can project the screen that I have up. Here we go. So 9 folks voted yes and 1 person voted no. So we will be allowing organizations that previously received small grants funds to reapply this round. So thank you all for the discussion and the vote. We will go ahead and take a 10-minute break now, and we will reconvene at 2:25. We're going to start to dive into the video prompts component of the agenda. Joel, if you don't mind sharing the slideshow again. Awesome, thank you. Take your time, and once that is up, Erica will take us away. For folks who are virtual, we're just giving our tech folks time to get the PowerPoint uploaded, so we will be with you shortly. Keep on going, Joel. We're on video prompts. Awesome, thank you.
Great. So now we are going to move on to addressing the video component of the application. After I provide some context for your discussion, you will brainstorm prompts for the video component of the Small Grants Fund application from the perspective of the applicant and that of the reviewer. So the small grants, again, the small grants application will have two scored parts. The first part is the written application. The written application covers eligibility screening, program area and funding priority, staff and board demographic information, organizational mission and history, program description, approach to racial equity, approach to disability inclusion, and budget information. The second part is the video, which is the interactive component of the application for this funding round. The purpose of the video component is to give the applicant an opportunity to tell the story of their organization and program in a way that allows their unique strengths to shine. Applicants would submit videos that are no longer than 5 minutes, limit background noise and camera movement when recording, and upload the file to a file sharing site such as YouTube or Vimeo. Videos can be submitted in languages other than English, and PCL staff will arrange for City of Portland contractor to transcribe and translate the video information in the language spoken in the video. We are asking you to help us generate prompts that will help the applicants tell their stories in a meaningful way and help reviewers to be able to score the videos. If there are prompts you want covered in the video that we have already covered in the written application, we can edit the written application to accommodate that change. The application is not finalized until we have secured allocation committee approval.
Okay, so for this activity, we're going to do some small group work. And we're going to break you up into 3 groups of 3 to 4. And in that small group, you're going to be joined by a staff member who will take notes and they'll help facilitate if need be. But otherwise, you all will lead the conversation. And so in that group, you are going to focus on answering these 2 questions. So we want you to generate prompts for the video component of the application, and we want you to do it from 2 different perspectives. Imagine you're an applicant, and what prompts would help you in your program and organization shine. And then imagine that you are a reviewer, which you will be, so yay, community council. What information would you want to learn from the video in order to evaluate them and score them? So after this meeting, staff are going to use the content that you generate to craft and finalize the prompts for the video component of the small grants application, and we will amend and edit the written application accordingly as well. Does anyone have any questions before we break out into doing small group work? I'm just looking virtually as well to see if anyone has raised their hands. Stephen, please go ahead.
Quick question. Sorry if I missed this. How many questions have been used for the video in the past, and how long are the videos? What was the maximum length?
So for your first question, this is the first time we've used the videos. But I would suggest that we keep the prompts down to 3 to 4, depending on the complexity of the prompts. And for the length of the videos, 5 minutes.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so for small groups, we're going to have one in-person group, one hybrid group, and one all-virtual group. So the in-person group is going to be led by Erica, and that's going to include Dean, Amarachi, Kamala, and Lisa. Meg is going to have the hybrid group, and she will be joined by Jamie and Alex, and then Joel, if you could put Karina in with Meg and Laptop One, and that will be that crew. And then Brian will have the all virtual crew, and so that will be Lene, Steven, Jacob, and Brian. And you'll have 20 minutes in that group. section in the agenda. If you are joining us virtually, do you mind just giving me a thumbs up or a hey in the chat so I can make sure you're here? Awesome. Good to see you, Stephen. Thanks, Lene. Thanks, Jacob. Thanks, Karina. Okay. So we are going to pivot from talking about small grants to now talking about large grants. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide, Joel. So we're going to begin this conversation by recentering in the purpose of the Portland Children's Levy. The levy grew out of a need to increase opportunities for all of Portland's children. And we know that historic policies and practices have a direct relationship with disparities in outcomes for children navigating poverty and children of color. You all, as our community council and community engagement, prioritized limited resources for Black, Indigenous, and children and families of color, children with disabilities, youth who identify as LGBTQIA2S+, immigrant and refugee children and families, families earning low incomes, and children and families who live in East Portland or North Portland. So this past funding round saw a significant increase in demand while resources were substantially declining. So the number of applications received increased from 45% from the last large grants round in 2020. And PCL had a 200% increase in applications from organizations that did not have any PCL grants. And PCL resources for large grants that started July 1st are down 21% compared to fiscal year 24-25 funding levels. And this is due to declining levy revenue and spending down of PCL fund balance. So this decrease meant that there were not enough resources to continue all of PCL's grants at their fiscal year 24-25 level, never mind fund new grants. In total, applicants requested over $3 for every $1 available. And so this means that most applications approved for funding received far less than they requested. And the combination of these factors created numerous competing priorities in this past large grants funding round. So PCL staff, you all, the community council, and the allocation committee wrestled with hard questions in this round with decreased resources and increased demand. And some of the questions included how to balance continuing PCL funding for programs with positive performance with allocating funding to organizations who don't have PCL funding, who are meeting emerging or underserved community needs. We're also balancing funding for different sized organizations, including consideration for smaller organizations, which face more disadvantages compared to large organizations with grant writing experience and experience in competitive grant making processes. And then we were also balancing across the diversity of PCL's priority populations, their needs and their service priorities. So you all as the community council were involved in the recent large grants funding process from the beginning, and I circled the section of steps that you all were participating in. And so the large grants process began with the launch of the community council in 2023. And your purpose is to advise our Bureau on our policy and our processes and to strengthen our accountability to community priorities. And we had 13 meetings between now and 2023 that were used to advise staff on the large grants funding process. So you all identified goals for community engagement, priority topics for community input, and priority communities to engage. You all shaped the application and scoring criteria. You recommended that we recruit and train community members to read and score applications. You edited and improved funding priorities for the services that PCL would fund based on community engagement with over 700 community members from priority populations. You provided guidance on which types of applications to fund, which to deprioritize if they scored above the median, and which to prioritize if they scored below the median. And you selected one of 2 anonymous portfolios to recommend for funding. So at March's meeting, you all voted to recommend Portfolio A for funding. Those recommendations were then released to applicants and the allocation committee. Applicants were invited to submit testimony, written, video, or audio over 3 weeks, and then staff provided all of that testimony to the allocation committee, who had over 2 weeks to review it. The allocation committee met on April 23rd to review and discuss recommendations, and they unanimously approved the recommendations. You can find the approved list, or the list of approved applications and award amounts on our website, which I linked here. And then the next slides, which Meg is going to cover, summarize the high-level data about the approved applications.
All right, this table looks at the total number of organizations that applied, regardless of the number of applications they submitted, and by their cultural specificity and diversity of staff. It shows the percentage of organizations with applications approved for funding out of the total number of organizations that applied. A total of 110 organizations applied and 64 organizations had applications approved for funding. The allocation committee made large grants funding decisions that resulted in approving a greater portion of culturally specific organizations compared to non-culturally specific organizations. 76% of culturally specific organizations that applied had applications approved for funding, compared to 49% of the non-culturally specific organizations that applied. Among culturally specific organizations, 7 of 22 Black or African organizations were approved for funding, and 11 of 15 Latinx, Asian, Pacific Islander, Indigenous, and multiracial organizations were approved for funding. Using data provided in applications, we can also look at the diversity of staff in the non-culturally specific organizations. It is worth noting that some non-culturally specific organizations are also led by people who identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and for several of those organizations, over half of their staff are also identify as people of color. Non-culturally specific organizations, with less than half of their staff identifying as Black, Indigenous, and people of color, comprised the largest part of the applicant pool, yet they had the lowest portion of organizations selected for grants. PCL funds are public dollars. Regardless of the type of organization funded, PCL-funded services are open to any child or family seeking services. While the previous slide looked at the 64 organizations with applications approved for funding, this slide focuses on the 94 approved applications by type of organization. Among the 94 applications approved for funding, 71% of those applications were to organizations with majority Black, Indigenous, and people of color staff. This includes both culturally specific organizations and non-culturally specific organizations. These are represented by the blue slices on this pie chart. In addition, 50% of organizations approved for funding are smaller organizations with annual revenues between $750,000 and $6 million in annual revenues. And 42% haven't previously received PCL funding. Over half of those are culturally specific organizations. We also wanted to offer some examples of services that were awarded funding by the allocation committee and that are provided by organizations that are non-culturally specific. Many of these services are specific to other PCL priority populations such as houseless families and children, LGBTQIA2S+ youth, justice-impacted children and families with disabilities. And in fact, this was the first time that applications for LGBTQIA2S+ mentoring services were selected for funding. Many of these services include programs that PCL is currently funding, have had positive performance, and demonstrated success engaging children and families.
So after the allocation committee unanimously approved funding recommendations on April 23rd, the package went to City Council for final approval. The act that governs PCL operations requires that City Council approve allocation committee funding decisions or remand by funding category. The authority to remand by funding category means that the council may send allocation committee decisions in an entire program area back to the allocation committee for reconsideration if those decisions were not made based on the application scores and other community conditions to foster a balanced and integrated citywide system of services. City Council, as the remanding body, does not have the authority to substitute its own decisions for the decisions made by the allocation committee. On May 13th, City Council and PCL staff met for a work session. City Council does not take verbal or written testimony at work sessions. Staff presented about the funding round process, and councilors were able to ask questions or raise concerns. On May 21st, City Council had a first reading of the ordinance to approve the large grants funding decisions of the allocation committee. Verbal and written testimony were accepted during the May 21st first reading with Council. Council considered a remand during the first reading, but the ordinance moved to a second reading. Council members requested more information on a range of issues. PCL staff prepared written responses to the concerns Council raised and sent them to Council prior on the June 4th second reading of the ordinance. On June 4th, after an extensive discussion of the awards, the Council voted 7-5 to remand all of the allocation committee's decisions. They then voted unanimously to extend the FY 24-25 grants for 1 year while developing instructions for the remand and next steps. In the wake of the remand, City Council and PCL staff received advocacy and testimony asking if it would be possible for the City Council to reconsider and revote on their decision. On June 18th, the allocation committee met and staff presented an update of City Council discussion and decisions. The allocation committee heard testimony from organizations who were not receiving PCL funds who would have received money starting July 1st had the City Council approved allocation committee decisions. On June 25th, City Council heard testimony from organizations impacted by their June 4th decision, reconsidered their decision, and ultimately voted 12-0 to reverse their remand and approve the allocation committee funding decisions made on April 23rd. Funding for the new large grants started on July 1st, 2025. City councilors expressed a variety of concerns when they initially voted to remand the allocation committee funding decisions, both about the outcomes of the process and the use of selection criteria. Some of their concerns conflict with one another and were about whether the allocation committee struck the right balance among different priorities. So for some examples, one councilor expressed concerns that organizations without PCL funds were favored over current grantees, particularly legacy Black-led organizations. Other councilors expressed concerns that smaller organizations and organizations without current PCL funding faced undue barriers. One councilor expressed concerns that lower scoring applications were recommended over higher scoring applications. Other councilors expressed specific concerns that the lowest scoring application in hunger relief was not selected for funding. Some councilors expressed a desire to fund effective, proven programs, while others questioned why specific current grantees with performance concerns did not have applications approved for those same programs.
Some city councilors expressed concern about the funding process that was conducted. The following slides are a summary of their concerns along with information staff provided in their response. Regarding the application submission, based on feedback received from an applicant, councilors expressed concern that staff prevented an after-school applicant from making a correction to an application, and that application was not funded because they were prevented from correcting it. Staff informed councilors in writing that the corrected data submitted by the applicant, a current grantee, was actually for the annual performance report for July 1 of 2023 to June 30th of 2024, not the grant application. PCL staff met with the grantee and communicated the performance concerns verbally and in writing multiple times throughout fall of 2024 and winter 2025. Grantee had multiple opportunities to correct inaccurate information but did not do so until after recommendations were released. On March 7th, 2025, PCL staff recommendations were released to all applicants, and performance concerns were cited as a reason for not recommending the grantee's application for future funding. On March 25th, 2025, the applicant contacted PCL staff to request substantial changes to previous performance data. Staff declined to allow past data reports to be corrected or to change their funding recommendation given the timing of the request. Past opportunities provided to correct the data, early notification of performance concerns, and no documentation submitted to support the new data. The applicant included the performance data in written testimony that was considered by the allocation committee as part of their decision-making process. No current grantees were offered the opportunity or permitted to correct previously submitted data reports after funding recommendations were sent to applicants. Counselors expressed concern that reviewers were not diverse and representative of applicant demographics, biased, lacked knowledge about the organizations submitting the applications and the relationships that they have with community served, and that reviewers overweighted the quality of grant writing, which unfairly disadvantaged less experienced applicants. One counselor was concerned that an application selected for funding was not scored at all. Staff informed counselors that all applications were scored. 4 reviewers read and scored each application, and the application score was the median of the 4 reviews. Using the median mitigated the impacts of the outlier scores. Staff would also share that reviewers had extensive lived and professional experience with PCL's program areas and racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. 88% had professional lived experience in one or more program areas. 59% had direct experience working in racial equity, diversity, and inclusion, and 24% had direct experience working in disability inclusion. At least 54% identified their lived experience as a person of color, immigrant, refugee, living with disability, navigating poverty, survivor of abuse, or with experience in the foster care system. Reviewers were not required to disclose their demographics on the sign-up form because selecting volunteers or employees based on demographics is illegal. Many still chose to include details about their lived experience when discussing their qualifications. PCL staff provided training, including on bias mitigation, to all reviewers as part of their onboarding. Some counselors were concerned that allocation committee members may not have reviewed the submitted testimony from applicants. Allocation committee members received testimony and had more than 2 weeks to review it before the April 23rd meeting to make the funding decision. Some counselors expressed concern regarding the consideration of grantee performance in decision-making. One counselor was concerned that current grantees were penalized for poor performance during COVID, and that organizations without PCL funding were favored because they didn't have previous performance records with PCL. Other counselors expressed that the desire to fund effective programs. Staff shared that we accounted for the impact of COVID pandemic on all current grantees by only concerning performance data from July 1 of 2022 to December 31st of 2024, the 2.5 years after the pandemic. Some counselors suggested that applicants should provide disaggregated data on the demographics of their board, staff, and clients. Staff shared that in previous funding rounds, a chart was included in applications that tracked this data. It was not included in applications in this funding round based on feedback after PCL's previous funding round and recent input from PCL's Community Council. They advised that that level of detail was burdensome for applicants, particularly for smaller organizations and those that currently do not have PCL grants. Instead, the application requests disaggregated demographic data on clients, staff, and board members, including race, ethnicity, primary language, gender, and disability status in a narrative format, giving applicants flexibility on how to include it. Applicants provided this information in varying ways and with varying specificity. For example, many small organizations did not provide detailed data on all race, ethnicity, identities for clients, staff, and board members. PCL staff could not provide disaggregated data for counselors due to the way applicants provided the data in applications. Mike, Lisa.
Oh, I sound quiet, that's why. Thanks. So some counselors expressed concerns that 3 applications from Black-led organizations weren't approved for funding. And specifically in hunger relief, one application wasn't approved for funding because it scored last, 23 out of 23, and no application that scored last in any program area was approved for funding. The applicant and some counselors expressed concern about the comments made by one of the reviewers that scored the application, which were focused on the writing quality and not the content. However, all 4 of those reviewers on that panel that scored the application, they all scored this application low. It was either the lowest or the second lowest among the 7 applications that panel scored. And the same panel highly scored other applications submitted by Black-led organizations, and those higher scoring applications were selected for funding. So we let them know that information. In mentoring, one application wasn't selected for funding because it was submitted by a large organization, meaning the annual revenues were over 18 million. That was a current PCL grantee. Community Council, as you know, deprioritized applications from current grantee organizations for programs that were not currently funded by PCL in favor of providing access to funding for smaller organizations, annual revenues below 6 million, and organizations without current PCL grants. The organization that submitted the mentoring application was approved for continued funding in after-school and foster care for a combined total of more than 1.9 million over 3 years. In addition, 6 applications from other Black-led organizations were approved in mentoring, and these applications met Community Council priorities for funding small organizations and organizations that did not currently have PCL grants. And after school, one application wasn't approved because the program was a current grantee and had significant performance concerns in FY24. And I won't go over the details because Joel really reviewed that application in detail around the counselors' concerns. So those were the 3 applications that counselors specifically had difficulties with it. We tried to provide the reasoning for why the committee didn't select it. And go to the next slide, please. So kind of moving on to next steps and what we're heading currently, we are in the midst of negotiating all of the contracts and the budgets with all of the current grants that have been approved by City Council, and that includes orienting 27 new organizations to PCL funding and to city grants management processes. Which is quite a lift, as those of you who know our processes are familiar with. We're also setting up all the forms and process to manage all our grants and web grants now, which is that's the city grants management system that we used for the application process. So we're kind of going to get everyone broken into using a new system. And then in addition to that set of work, we are working on a process improvement report. So the ordinance that passed, that City Council passed that approved all of the allocation committee decisions also contained the following language. It asked us to provide the council with a report. So it asked the allocation committee specifically, so staff will need to assist them, to include a report that includes a summary of how the allocation committee addressed or plans to address concerns raised by council during the remand process, which you all heard about just now, including consideration of racial equity impacts, scoring inconsistencies, and testimony from applicants. The summary should also describe how the allocation committee assessed whether the programs serve a majority of the intended demographic population, defined as more than 51%, particularly in the case of culturally specific or responsive grants, and the committee shall also include a plan to discuss how to clearly assess and value the extent to which an applicant's leadership and board composition reflect the populations they intend to serve. So after past funding rounds, staff gathers feedback from multiple audiences, and we use that input along with the data, the kind of data that you heard today, around the funding process to identify strengths and areas for improvement. So we're planning a similar process now that the large grant funding round has finished up, and we'll be collecting feedback from applicants. We have already collected feedback from reviewers, staff, community council. You all get a chance to give input today, and the allocation committee. And we'll use that information along with the data, like we presented today, to respond to their concerns and present them with a report as they direct it. We don't have an exact timeline on that yet. It will kind of maybe depend a little bit on how fast we can get through contract negotiations and finish that piece of work up. We'll make that report available to all other stakeholders as well when it's complete.
Okay, so that was the update about the large grants funding process. So this now is going to be open space for you all as our community council to ask staff questions, discuss what you've learned and heard today, and reflect on what worked well about the large grants funding process and what you would want to see change. So we have been running a little fast, so we have about 45 minutes or so for this discussion and questions. And then after that, we're going to move to some solo reflection where you're going to have the opportunity to reflect on the community council's role in the large grants funding process and share any other feedback that you all have. So we'll take just a minute or two right now for you all to process what you've heard and jot down any thoughts or questions that you have before we launch into big group discussion. So we'll just take a minute or two for you to gather your thoughts. Okay, so we'll go ahead and move into large group discussion. So this is open space for you all to ask questions and share your feedback.
I can start. One thing that came up for me is around relationships, and I know there's a report that's going to go to City Council to help address their information requests, and I'm curious if there's relationship building that will be going above and beyond that report, just because it seemed like there was a lot of trust that could be built over time before the next cycle is presented. That's my observation.
It's complicated, I'll just say, because we are technically not allowed to do that. City staff is not supposed to be contacting council offices directly to speak and build relationship with councilors. Those relationships are supposed to be managed through your service area and through your deputy city administrator, so essentially my boss. So it's a little bit complicated to make that happen. But I think that the DCA, and we have now switched service areas, so this is something that's kind of invisible to you all, but we've been plunked around in different places, the Children's Levy, with the city reorganization, and we were in one service area, now we're in a different one. So we're now working with a new boss and a new group of people, a new set of folks. And so how that will all get managed, it's hard for me to prognosticate it. The switch has just been made. We've just been put over in the last couple of months to this new area. So I agree with you. I think that would be helpful. I don't know how much of it we will be able to do or be permitted to do.
Lisa, do you mind using your mic just so folks who are virtual can hear you?
What area are you in now?
We were moved from the Vibrant Communities area, which was Parks and the Arts Office of Arts and Culture and us, and that was discontinued as a service area. And we were moved to the Community and Economic Development service area, which is got lots of different bureaus in it. So that it's a bigger group of folks overall.
I just wanted to say that I'm sorry that you guys had to suffer under all those shenanigans with the counselors. I feel like that seemed very unnecessary for you guys to have to go through all of that, in my opinion.
Thanks.
Stephen, yeah, please jump in. Sorry.
Sorry, no worries. I definitely want to echo that sentiment and commend you all as staff for going through the process and clearly being able to defend a lot of the intentional design that was put into it, that clarified a lot of the concerns and ensured that this whole large grant review process was rigorous and led to strong outcomes. So thank you for leading through that challenging time. I'm curious, as you reflect back, and maybe it's too early to do so, but even as we start to think about the next large grant cycle, which I know will come a little later, but do you have lessons, whether it's related to the review process and application process itself, or even around, well, going back to the review process, that there was an intentionally designed multi-stage like handoff process from the community or well staff to community council to allocation committee and then to city council, and it makes sense why um, the city council ultimately was not as proximate and close and didn't understand the nuances and the rigorous process that was in place. But yeah, curious if you have reflections and thoughts on how to improve the application and or review next time.
I'm not sure that my reflections are fully baked yet, but when I think about one of the things that caused harm and frustration from the perspective of at least one applicant, it came down to what a reviewer wrote for their comments on our review forms. And so I think when I think about things we could do differently and better, while we did train reviewers and we did say everything that you write is public record, please be constructive. As we all know, there are times when you're listening in a meeting and times when you're not. And so it could have just been the moment that reviewer tuned out. But I think we do have to sort of give more specific guidance and instruction about what are examples of constructive comments, what are not. Now that we have this example, I think we could actually use it very constructively. I think that I don't think I would necessarily seek to invite that particular reviewer back to participate again. But then I also think that in general, when we use community reviewers, we are going to community volunteers who are doing review potentially for the first time. I think we are going to encounter a range of skill and interest and attention, and I don't think we can prevent things that may not feel good from the perspective of an applicant. This time around we had 4 different people read each application. We took the median score to try to control for bias, and to some extent I think we did the best that we could do. Can we learn something on how to train reviewers differently and better? Absolutely. But that's one of the ones that stuck with me the most so far.
Yeah, I think it's also about the reviewer piece. It's challenging because I read some of those and I thought, oh, what the reviewer is saying is valid. It's just very direct. So if you're a person who speaks very direct, and you're not used to being on the recipient end, you might not quite understand how that lands, But it wasn't that the points were invalid points. It was in the delivery. So I think that's something that we could talk more about in the reviewer training. And then I think another thing is where I saw some of the smaller organizations struggle was in the specificity of telling us about their demographics. Like they're just like, we're all Black, or we're all BIPOC, or we're all Black or brown, but that's not very specific, And so I saw that being an area of struggle. So I would think again about doing the table maybe in the easiest way as possible, just so people are really having to put numbers in, because that's obviously not like what everybody was thinking. I think that was a struggle for some of those who scored lower.
I think we are touching on, Erica, if I might provide a thought, is something that actually is that I've been discussing with some people that is very relevant and makes this maybe even a Portland specific issue in the sense of Portland does not like bluntness and directness. As an autistic person, I feel that. And so we have to remember that as well, and remember that our culture is a lot more, for lack of a better term, passive aggressive in some senses in Portland, and that we should keep that in mind when we are evaluating the quality of the reviewer's feedback as well. And it's something that we honestly should be working on in general, since I think that that's something that has contributed to a few issues in recent times. So that's all. Thank you.
I might add to your question, Stephen, I might add that, and this isn't necessarily reflecting everybody's opinions here at the Levy, it's mostly mine, and I think Erica shares it, that I think there were some challenges with the testimony where people felt like their testimony wasn't heard because they didn't see a reaction to it in real time. In the past, we've made choices to ask people to submit written or video testimony because they've told us that when we're in the allocation committee meeting and we have to go up and we have to testify, we feel like we're being pitted against each other. And that is not a good feeling. And we don't like that because we all collaborate with each other all the time. And so we don't want to be, us versus them. But then when we changed it to the written and video testimony, I think there was some challenge around people not seeing the reaction and not feeling like they had a feedback mechanism to know that their testimony had been appropriately considered. So there were challenges that kind of maybe impacted people's perception of whether or not they were heard throughout the process in the same way.
That I just want to sort of echo what just Brian said. That was my message to my team and others is that that was my big learning moment, is that there needs to be some sort of feedback. I understand and respect why we did not do that, because we heard from applicants that they did not necessarily like that process, but there needs to be a feedback loop besides just the Q&A process. We did have a feedback loop. We had the Q&A for everybody to see any and all answers and questions that we provided regarding the application process and funding process. And I think there still needs to be an avenue for people to have, whether it's in a group setting, an individual setting, it's something that we, whether you as a community council, we as an organization, is going to have to figure out for the next funding cycle and how to have some process like that.
I wanted to think about a couple other points that people raised around the testimony piece in the past that I think led to the decision to make it written and video, and that was also from the perspective of the allocation committee, who felt they could not take in the information. It was too in a personal one meeting. We did testimony. We've done it in a variety of ways, but testimony meetings, and it was too much. They said I'm glazing over after an hour of listening to program after program after program try to tell the story to me, that I want to take it in so I can actually listen to it. So it was not only the applicants, it was also the people who were trying to use the information that people were bringing forward that talked about that. And I think as you sit as reviewers and potential hearers of testimony, that may be something that you think about as well. Like, what format allows you to take something in adequately and consider it. That's one other point, but I've lost that now.
I mean, I will say in terms of government funding and contracting work, PCL is pretty unique in that they even allow applicants to testify or try to lobby around decisions. At the county, when we were doing a largely a really similar process to you all, we were running an RFPQ, a request for programmatic qualifications, and you get scored, you get reviewed, you receive that information, you are allowed to protest, but only in the sense that you think that something unethical or untoward, or there was a conflict of interest that wasn't provided, like something was wrong with the process, not necessarily that you just disagree with the decisions or the recommendations. So while I can appreciate the desire to have feedback from folks, I think it's hard to put a lot of work and time and effort into trying to make a process as fair as possible and then kind of have to contend with this other function of having folks able to kind of use their organizational oomph to lobby in the ways that disproportionately impact smaller organizations or less connected organizations or folks who may not, have the ear of a county or a city commissioner. So I think that's honestly something for the allocation committee to consider, like how they're asking for and utilizing feedback in that way, and like what the boundaries are around that.
Well, lucky for me, you spoke to the point I forgot, because that was the other reason that people pushed, and why I think PSU recommended in their study that we eliminate testimony. That came from them, from their talking to folks, that we eliminate oral testimony in decision meetings or even in separate meetings, was people didn't feel they had equal access to decision makers because some folks had personal relationships and some folks did not. And so that was the other piece of Genesis. So I just don't want to lose the entire picture. I'm saying these things mostly just so you understand the whole panoply of reasons why things have been done one way and done a different way, and kind of what the pros and cons might be.
I just wanted to invite any folks who are virtual who haven't spoken yet, if there are any questions or reflections that you wanted to share. Any other thoughts from folks in the room?
I mean, do you anticipate any sort of repeat of this process with the small grants cycle?
I do feel when we were discussing the policy question about, whether folks could reapply, and I felt like there were echoes of the large grants process in that discussion, but I don't know. I guess I would defer that question over to Lisa. It's small grants is a lot less high stakes than large grants, 1.5 million compared to 64 plus million. So I'm trying to be cautiously optimistic.
To some people, $30,000 is a lot of money, where to other people,
Yeah.
to some people, $30,000 is a lot of money, where to other people, that's a small amount of money,
But in terms of the overall city budget, which is, I don't know, billions, so.
I mean, it's a good question, and I'm wondering the same myself. I'm hoping that we can prepare a report that maybe they have a little bit more time and less pressure to consider what all the options are for how one does a process, and kind of the trade-offs that there are, or the competing priorities that one can have. You can want two things that are not, they're working against each other, and to reckon with that is hard, I think, for any decision maker. So I'm hopeful that will have some impact, and that would come to them. I mean, our goal would be to have that report given to them and all the feedback done before we come with small grants decisions. And we can also hopefully maybe in that same report perhaps add something about what the small grants design ends up to be, so they could have a heads up on that. I think we would try for that. There is a complicating factor here that I'm not sure how this will all go because, as you know, the federal executive orders are coming down and will affect Portland if Portland is going to use federal money for other. We don't have federal money in the Portland Children's Levy, but the current understanding is the feds are going to make everybody adhere to their orders if they're taking any federal money, regardless of the specific program parameters. So I don't know what, I think City Council is just taking that up in the next week, maybe. So how that will affect what we can do and the way that the process can actually move forward, I don't know yet. And so I don't know how City Council is going to behave in that climate if they choose to take federal money.
One other factor is that as staff, we are hoping to, though it might not be possible, to try and bring the allocation committee decisions for small grants fund to City Council before they're dealing with the budget, if possible. But that has ripple implications all the way back to now in terms of like getting the timing of everything out. So that's what we're hoping for, but we can't promise it, but we're trying for that.
I think the only other reflection that I had is because the structure of the city council is so new, and they're like, obviously at this point in their tenure where they're like drinking from the fire hose and trying to like make a budget and like do all of the things. I think one area for like relationship building that might help them and is like not just you all trying to get a briefing, which is hard, is I wonder if there's opportunity for the allocation committee and the city council at large to do something together so that perhaps the city council members that aren't involved in the allocation committee can feel a little bit more like at ease with the decisions that are coming from allocation committee. No, just knowing who those folks are, and there's like, I feel like there's this like layering of expertise. It's like you all, and as staff, have like the highest level of expertise, and then it filters up to the allocation committee, and then it filters up to the city council. So if maybe those two upper layers can kind of be a little bit more in sync, it would create less push and pull for you all as staff.
Well, if there are no further thoughts, then I'll move us to some solo reflection. Okay. So I sent out a Microsoft form, and don't click on the link yet because it's not open. But I sent out a link this morning to an evaluation of the large grants funding process, and in it, I'm asking you both to reflect on the conversation that we just had, but then also to reflect specifically on the community council's role in the large grants funding process and kind of the actions and the ways that your feedback was integrated into the funding process. So just when you get to those questions, keep that in mind because we definitely want to be thinking about how to improve how we've engaged you as our advisory body in our decision-making process. So let me go ahead and open up that link for you. Don't restart now. Okay, so I just set the form to accept responses, and it's the Large Grants Funding Process Community Council Reflections and Feedback form. So we'll have about 15 minutes for you all to fill that out. If you are still filling out the evaluation, please continue to do so. So big picture, we just wanted to say thank you so much for your time and for the discussion today, for your feedback. We will work on integrating it into the small grants project plan and the application eligibility criteria and the prompts. The next full community council meeting is going to be sometime this winter, and we'll be gathering you all to train you to review and score the videos. And that'll be in preparation for making funding recommendations. And between now and then, I'll be reaching out to everyone to schedule one-on-ones just to check in and touch base. So before you leave, we have just our standard meeting evaluation, and then if you could fill out a stipend invoice if you're getting an invoice and leave that with me. And yeah, make sure to leave both of those with me before you depart, or if you're joining virtually, go ahead and email them to me. And I will hang out if anyone has any other questions. Otherwise, thank you all for your time today.